Hi, welcome to this week's chapter of Jack D. Stazier's book, Land Beyond All Roads. This week's chapter has a lot of interesting stories. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it, so let's get started. It is entitled, The Smell of Elk. There are a few pictures that Jack put in this book that I will add to this video, probably at the beginning. So make sure you take a peek and enjoy. My first backcountry elk hunt in the Bob Marshall Wilderness was a mixture of excitement, fun, and tragedy. Most backcountry hunts are fun and exciting, but on this trip there was tragedy. Things don't get any more tragic than when horses and people die. This pack trip was with a couple of friends and my brother, David. We all had experience with horses, but he had never used horses to pack the equipment that was needed for a hunting camp deep into the wilderness. I think most of us will agree that if you're loving what you're doing, some of the best memories are made when learning something new. As you would guess, this trip had some great memories, but then some not so great. Speaking of memories, the best term I can think of to describe us on this pack trip comes from a memory of my grandfather, who always used the word greenhorn to describe people who were trying to do something they knew nothing about. He would have called us a bunch of greenhorns. This was a trip about firsts. Our first time to use horses as pack animals, to transport livestock 200 miles to a trailhead, and the first time to be hunting more than 20 miles into the land beyond all roads. We didn't even know how to erect the wall tent we had bought. All these firsts created an environment with opportunity for some incredible memories that I will always cherish. In turn, for others who have interest in hunting the backcountry, reading about this adventure is a great opportunity to learn from our mistakes. Financially, this hunt was also a challenge because we were all young family men. Backcountry hunts are expensive undertakings. Our biggest financial challenge was to transport more than a ton of equipment, gear, and our animals to the trailhead. Fortunately, my friend Wayne owned and operated a front-end alignment shop, and my brother was a mechanic for a road construction company. We pitched in and bought an inexpensive, beat-up old truck to haul the horses. With Dave and Wayne's expertise, we restored the old truck, turning it into a flatbed with stock racks that was capable of hauling 6 horses. We kept hoping we had done a good enough job that it would be dependable enough to travel the 400 miles round trip without leaving us or our livestock stranded on some backcountry road. The biggest challenge to ensure a successful backcountry pack trip is having animals that are trained to pack and knowing how to pack them. It was lucky for us we all had some very well broke horses, but not so lucky that none of us knew anything about packing. So, we had read numerous books on how to pack a horse and enlisted the help of our friend Rocky, who had packed for the Forest Service. He taught us the basics, and later even went on hunting and summer pack trips with us. Getting everything organized and ready for this hunting trip reminded me of when I was a kid waiting for Christmas. It seemed like it was taking forever, but the big day finally arrived. The plan was that my brother and I would meet up with our friends at the trailhead around midnight because David was driving over from Seattle. I told one of the hunting partners, Jody, not to worry about us for being late. Driving that old truck loaded down with 6 head of horses, we would be lucky to get to the trailhead by 1 o'clock. He smiled, saying, "Jack, in that truck, you'll be lucky to get there at all." Then he told me he would be hauling 7 head in his horse trailer to the trailhead, and they wouldn't worry about us until daylight the next day. After David and I left Libby, our first mishap was after encountering a cloudburst in the dark. Our windshield wiper stopped working. Before we could find a place to pull off the road, we almost hit somebody's stray cow. Then, already wet and cold from repairing the wipers in the rain, the heater quit. I remember thinking, if we could not get the heater working, it was going to be a long trip to the trailhead. David kept tinkering with the heater, and, like with the windshield wipers, eventually we got the heater working. The next issue was the brakes. When transporting stock, braking slowly ensures the safety of your animal, especially when hauling them in a stock truck. This keeps the horses from shifting from side to side and slamming into the horse in front of them. So when hauling horses, you never make sudden stops unless you have to. I thought the brakes on our stock truck worked fine because I had not been in a situation where I had to make a quick stop. When driving through Kalispell, I found out I was wrong. I believed I had enough time to make it through an intersection, but the light turned red just before I entered it. I tried to stop and was surprised to find out the brakes only slowed me down. I stood up on the brakes and still could not stop. We went through the intersection with cars swerving and honking in front of and behind us. I had to speed up to keep from hitting another vehicle. After a couple of deep breaths, David and I realized we'd come extremely close to not only ending our hunt, but possibly also our lives, the lives of the other drivers, and our animals. Even today, when I think of what could have happened, it frightens me. As soon as we got back from our trip, I put a power booster on the brakes and made the brakes work adequately. When we finally made it to the trailhead, it was after 4 o'clock in the morning, but that didn't bother us. What mattered was that we had not been in a terrible accident and that our truck hadn't broken down. The heater in the truck even kept working for most of the trip. Life was good. The next morning, my brother and I were standing around a crackling hot campfire in our hooded coveralls, which were basically expensive snowmobile suits. Every time one of our hunting partners would crawl out of their sleeping bags and come over to the fire, they would start chuckling, teasing us about being wimpy because of us dressing so warm. We told them, it's not that we think it's cold, we're just prepared for the severe storm warnings that's been on the radio. Supposed to be blizzard-like conditions. Jody walked over to the fire and said, didn't know anything about the storm advisory. Got an extra pair of those goofy-looking coveralls? Everyone on this trip knew cold weather could be dangerous. But David and I had just gotten back from working in Alaska and had been in weather as cold as 80 below without a chill factor. We both had a lot of respect for blizzard-like conditions and knew strange things happen when it gets extremely cold. Neither one of us will forget our first morning at work in the Alaskan pipeline, seeing people throwing their cups of coffee into the air, watching it freeze before it hit the ground. Except for Wayne, our buddies had brought clothes cowboys would wear on a roundup, Levi pants and jackets and cowboy hats. It didn't take long before they stopped laughing at our cold weather gear and wished they had not been trying to look like cowboys. In their defense, they had hunted this area the year before, dressed like the way they were, and did just fine. Unlike my brother and I, they had not spent time playing in the high mountains of northwest Montana, or they would have known the weather was as unpredictable as a young colt. In the middle of August, I've seen the temperatures go from 80 degrees to snowing within hours. We didn't waste any time trying to get started up the trail, but because it was the first time my cowboy buddies had put packs on some of their animals, we had a couple of rodeos. After a rough start, we were on our way up the Spotted Bear River. We would be camping close to a Forest Service cabin called Pentagon, and we would be hunting at a high plateau that rubs up against the Continental Divide called Heart Basin. The closer we got to our campsite, the more I kept worrying about how we were going to set up our wall tent. We all knew what a wall tent looked like, but didn't have an idea how to set one up. Fortunately, a few miles before our campsite, we ran into a Forest Service ranger. Swallowing my pride, I told him that we were such greenhorns, we didn't even know how to set up a wall tent. The ranger got off his horse, picked up a stick, and drew a diagram in the dirt, while he explained to us what to do. Thanks to the ranger, our problem was solved. Eventually, we made it to Pentagon, the trip being several hours longer than what it took us when we hunted the area in later years. We had not yet learned how to keep the packs, called manis, from gradually sliding to one side or the other of a horse, so we would have to keep stopping our pack string, get off our animals, and go back and readjust the packs. Otherwise, the packs would eventually slide down to one side and end up underneath the belly of the horse or mule. This can cause pack animals to take off running and bucking, which is dangerous for the animal and anyone near it, and has the potential of tearing up a pack saddle. Because we were not expecting much help or wanting to rely on our other hunting partners, David, Wayne, and I divided the responsibilities between us. Wayne would do the cooking because he did a lot of cooking at home and was a very good cook. In fact, in the coming years, Wayne turned out to be the best backcountry cook I was ever around. I would take care of the stock because I owned the stock David, Wayne, and I would be using. So I knew which saddle fit what animal and could saddle the animals faster than my hunting buddies. Besides, I enjoyed being the wrangler, and I didn't want to worry about the livestock being fed and watered. Because David was the biggest and strongest, he would be responsible for cutting the firewood for our wood stove. Looking back, this memory is an excellent example of us being greenhorns. The reason for this is that what we had David using to cut up the logs for the wood stove was an antique cross-cut saw that I'd bought. The funny thing is, I can remember how excited I was to find it at a rummage sale. I also remember it had rusted and corroded teeth, which probably hadn't been sharpened in 50 years. What I can't remember is why we didn't think it needed to be sharpened. The typical log David would cut for firewood would be 18 to 20 inches through, and it would take him a half an hour of very hard work to cut just one round off a log. We all knew David had the toughest job, but we were thinking he would get help from our other two partners. It amazes me how many years it took us to buy a new crosscut, and then to find out that if we keep it sharp, it would cut almost as fast as a chainsaw. Thinking back, it's hard for me to believe how many hours of hard work we spent cutting up firewood. My brother is convinced the reason it took us so long to figure this out was because he was the one doing the sawing. For not knowing what we were doing, it didn't really take us that much time before we had a well-organized camp with a very warm, spacious wall tent. That night it started raining. And when I say raining, I mean it poured all night and was raining even harder in the morning. This caused our other partners to decide to stay in the tent all day because they said it would be silly to hunt in that kind of miserable weather. There are 5 different trails leaving from Pentagon, all going in different directions. Daylight found David, Wayne, and me several miles up the trail, heading west towards Spotted Bear Pass. The rain didn't bother us. That's what we figured rain gear was for. Besides, it's better hunting in the rain. It's a lot harder for the animals to hear you, and the rain keeps your scent on the ground. Not long after daylight, it started snowing, which made us even more excited because fresh snow makes it ideal for tracking elk. We'd seen where a small herd of elk came into the trail close to where Goat Creek runs into the Spotted Bear River. The herd was headed towards the Continental Divide, which is the west boundary of the Sun River Game Refuge. We drew straws to see who would follow them. David won. Wayne and I continued towards Spotted Bear Pass. We hadn't gone more than a half a dozen miles when another herd came into the trail. It looked as though our hopes were coming true. The storm was causing the migraine to start, and the hunting conditions were ideal, because it was snowing hard enough we could tell where the tracks were fresh. We were in luck. These tracks were not more than 15 minutes old, with only a few flakes of snow in them. We tied up our horses and started tracking elk. Most hunters love to track elk in fresh snow, but it is a gamble because it is hard to know whether the elk are going to keep going and never stop. Sometimes, if elk are migrating, they can easily travel 20 miles or more in a day. Wayne and I had tracked the herd for only a couple of miles when their tracks started wandering around through the timber instead of being in single file up the mountain. For those of you who don't know, this means the elk are starting to feed and then would usually bed down. We slowed our pace, taking a few steps, then stopping and looking around for a few minutes trying to see the elk before they saw us. It wasn't long before I saw him, a beautiful, mature 6-point buck, standing broadside in a small clearing. I made a quick shot, aiming behind the front shoulder. The wind was blowing from the bull to us, so he had not winded or seen us, and didn't have any idea where we were. The bull made a 90-degree turn and started running downhill in a direct line right towards us. This is one of those memories that is still so vivid, it's like a movie being played over and over again in my mind. I can see this magnificent bull with ivory-tipped horns charging down the mountain like a locomotive directly towards me. He was running through a meadow crowded with head-high fir trees that had snow hanging heavy on their limbs. Huge, fluffy snowflakes were floating down, making the scene look like a Christmas card. The bull was up to his knees in snow, crashing through and over the fir trees, causing snow to fly in all directions. Wayne was off to my left, about 20 or 30 yards. Although I couldn't see him through the trees, I could hear him shooting at the bull too. The elk didn't turn away from me until he was within 12 to 15 yards, where he headed down a steep grade. He must have died when he was still on his feet, because he didn't even quiver after he hit the ground. I was shooting a 7mm Magnum, and Wayne was shooting a 30-06. We both hit the bull several times. In fact, when we were skinning him out from the bullet holes, it looked like neither one of us had missed even one shot. One of the first things Wayne did was cut the tenderloins out of the bull. He carefully laid these over a log that was under a tree, commenting on how good they would taste. Wayne has always been good at getting the animal ready to be packed out. He takes preparing the meat seriously, and even has his own butcher shop behind his house. It wasn't long before we were back to the horses, heading down the trail towards camp where David was waiting for us. Unfortunately for him, the herd of elk he was tracking didn't stop moving. He said he never even got close, and they were migrating towards the reserve. On the way back to camp, just before dark, we saw the biggest set of grizzly tracks I've ever seen, heading down the trail in front of us. My brother and I had seen several grizzlies and lots of tracks in Alaska, but we had not seen a grizzly track this big. This baffled us because Alaska bear are a larger species than those in Montana. It was still snowing hard, and there wasn't any snow on the grizzly tracks. That, and the fact my horse kept putting his nose down on the trail and smelling the tracks, meant we were getting really close to the bear. The last thing I remember seeing before it got dark was the grizzly tracks on the trail. We had all been on hunts where we had come back after dark, but never following a grizzly. If you don't ride horses, riding a horse at night is different than you might think. That's because they can see incredibly well in the dark. Like on this stormy, cloudy night, when you get in a heavy canopy of trees, it's so dark you can put your hand right up by your nose and not see it. Yet the horses will not miss a step, never stumble, and when going back to camp, will stay on the trail. You might think it would be prudent to use a flashlight, and sometimes we do if there are low-hanging branches on the trail. The typical Bob Marshall trails are like miniature roads, well maintained and very seldom have problems with low branches. So, wanting to save batteries and having trust in the animals, we almost always ride without the use of any artificial light. It's hard to explain, but it is enjoyable for us to ride in the dark. It can be exhilarating at times, like when we knew we were riding by a cliff where we could hear the roar of the river down below. I'll take the lead, I told them. I'm on a well-broke horse, and for the most part, bear don't bother me much. Wayne was behind me riding a little Appaloosa mare that I had just broke that summer. David was riding behind Wayne. My brother and I kept teasing Wayne about the fact that his horse had never been ridden at night before, and, like her sire, which I owned, she might be night blind. We probably shouldn't have done this, because he was already nervous about the bear in front of us. Suddenly, there was all kinds of breaking brush and the sound of running horses. One of the horses ran into my horse, hitting hard against his hindquarters, almost knocking him down when he ran it by me. I turned on my flashlight, asking what happened. I could see my brother behind me, and the mare Wayne had been riding in front of me, but I could not see Wayne. I yelled 3 times, "Wayne!" There was just silence. "Wayne!" I yelled 2 more times, and still didn't get an answer. Even though only a few seconds had gone by, David and I were afraid he had gotten seriously hurt and couldn't answer. I swung my leg over my horse, dropped to the ground, and walked back down the trail, trying to find Wayne with the flashlight. Finally, I heard Wayne say in a hushed voice, "I'm down here." I shied the light towards the direction of his voice and spotted him sitting next to some brush along the trail. "What happened? And why didn't you answer me? I was afraid you were hurt." Pointing off to his left, he said, "I think my horse got poked by that dead snag, then spooked and took off bucking." "Why didn't you answer me?" "I was afraid the bear spooked my horse, so I didn't want the grizzly to know where I was," he said. David and I immediately burst out laughing. "Don't you know that bear would find you whether you talked or not?" David teased. When I was walking up the trail to catch Wayne's horse, I couldn't help myself for a chance at a little dig at him. "Some friend you are, Wayne. You obviously don't care if the grizzly knew where I was." He got right back at me. "What are you whining about? Didn't I just hear you say bear don't bother you?" All I could think to say was, "I didn't say not at all. I said not much." It was well after midnight when we got back to camp. I started taking care of the stock, and my brother went to check on whether we had enough wood for the night. Wayne would be preparing dinner for us. It's probably time to explain that the other 2 hunters with us were clients of mine, to whom I'd sold property. I'd spent quite a bit of time with these guys and liked them, so invited them to go on a hunting trip. At the time, I thought because they had hunted areas like this before and could ride, they would be good hunting partners. I didn't understand their idea of backcountry hunting was a short horseback ride on a beautiful sunny day to a meadow where they could shoot a giant bull without even getting off their horse. They were definitely not prepared or willing to hike to a point of exhaustion and hunt the extreme weather of the Continental Divide. Just as I was thinking it was not fair to David and Wayne to have invited them to hunt with us, David came out of the tent just steaming and yelling at me. "Your friends burned all the wood because they spent the entire day in the tent and didn't cut a single round off any log for tonight." "I'll help cut wood after I'm done taking care of the stock," I told him, which seemed to calm him down. It got way cooler that night and was still snowing the next morning when we rolled out of our sleeping bags. My friends stayed behind once again, this time because it was too cold. By the time daylight broke, David, Wayne, and I again were several miles up the road on the way to pack out the bull. We were hoping we'd catch some more elk migrating towards the reserve, but the trip back to the bowl was uneventful. First thing we did when we got to the bowl was build a fire to keep our hands warm. As we began quartering up the elk, getting the meat ready to put into Manny's, then I noticed the tracks. Can you believe all the tracks that Martin made around the elk carcass? I asked David. That's more than one, David said, pointing out the different sizes of the tracks. We had trapped Martin with our dad, and were always excited to see Martin tracks. I really like all types of wildlife, but marten have always helped me enjoy my time in the backcountry, so they have a special place in my heart. For those of you who don't know, marten are fur-bearing animals that look a lot like a ferret or mink, only a little bigger. Their fur is considered some of the best there is, and that is where the expensive sable coats come from. As far back as I can remember, my father told us stories about trapping. When he was going to high school in Eureka, he was getting as much as $75 for marten pelt. Today, that doesn't sound like an incredible amount, but let me put it in perspective for you. It was in the 1920s, and back then times were hard. My grandfather was a supervisor for the State Highway Department that maintains the highway between Eureka and Libby. The men on his crew only made an average of $1 a day in wages. Marten were not as plentiful then as they are now. The most marten Dad caught in 1 year was 7, and he averaged 4 a year. But he also trapped Canadian lynx, coyotes, bobcat, mink, and muskrat. Beaver were protected and could not be trapped at that time. He made substantially more money going to school and trapping part-time than my granddad did working for the highway department. My grandfather told me several times after my dad was a teenager that the family was almost rich because of Dad's trapping money. Today, I don't think many people realize the value that fur pelts used to have. In the 1800s and early 1900s, fur was pretty much like gold. The high value of fur was what brought the first white men to this country, and why they were willing to risk their lives for it. Because of the value of fur, most fur-bearing animals were pretty much trapped out of the country. That's why beaver became so scarce and were protected from trapping by the time my dad was growing up. By the time he got to be a teenager, most of these animals were coming back, but still not in great numbers. It always amazed me that Dad had such a big country all to himself for trapping. I'm sure partly because trapping had become a lost art. Also, trapping took a great deal of time and hard work. Unlike today, the only way to access the backcountry was on snowshoes because they didn't have snowmobiles or four-wheel drive trucks. Dad had several trap lines, and some were over 20 miles long. Most people would be amazed at how much ground a trapper can cover in a day if they have spent a lot of time on snowshoes and are in good shape. The reason for this is that you learn to take long strides, and you glide with each stride. Because several of the trap lines were too long to make a return trip in 1 day, he spent the night in an old abandoned trapper's cabin that had been built years before. Dad talked to me about trapping marten more than anything else. I'm guessing it's because marten were worth so much more money, and they were special to him too. I'm sure it also has something to do with the country they inhabited. They live in the most remote and highest alpine basins in the mountains. These basins are the most pristine country in the high mountains and the most beautiful, especially in the winter, when there could be 20 feet of snow bending the trees towards the ground. This wonderland is extremely difficult to access and is seldom visited by man, which adds to the romance. Anyone who's been to a ski resort knows that the scenery in these high basins can be breathtaking. Because it's the habitat that marten need, if you know what to look for, you will see marten tracks at the ski resorts. I have not been to a ski resort in the Northwest where I haven't seen marten tracks. What I have found fun and interesting is no matter where I've hunted, Canada, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, in all the high alpine country, I've found old marten sets. When talking about trapping, a set is something trappers make in the woods that will help them catch the animal. Again, the value of these furs motivated these trappers to the point that there wasn't any place or anywhere they didn't trap. The kind of set I'm talking about that I can find, even if it has not been used for 100 years, is one where the trapper would chop into the side of the tree to make a notch, like the undercut or notch used when falling a tree. They would set the trap on a flat spot on the bottom of the wedge, then nail the meat they use for bait on the upper part of it. They did this to keep the trap from snowing under it, and so the marten would have to step on the trap in order to get the bait. These trappers tended to put a lot of sets along the Forest Service trails for easier access. I've even found the traps that were left by the trappers of old. I have discovered most of these sets while riding along a Forest Service trail in the high country looking for elk or mule deer. It is always exciting for me when I find one of these old sets. I can't help but admire these trappers because it was a lot of work for me to get to this country on a horse, and they were doing it on snowshoes, sometimes in the worst kind of weather imaginable. History tells us their life expectancy was very short. If it wasn't the weather conditions or having an accident and getting themselves hurt, it was usually unfriendly Native Americans that were the cause of their demise. I've always felt I was born 100 years too late. That's why one of the biggest reasons I love the wilderness areas in the backcountry is because things change less there than anywhere. It really is pretty much like it was 100 years ago. Why I get so much enjoyment out of finding these sets is somehow, when I find one, it always feels like I have made a connection with a real mountain man, the kind of man I would love to have been. We all know that trees live a long time, but I still find almost all these sets in old snags where the trees had died years ago. It saddens me that as the years go by, I am finding a lot fewer of these sets. That's because the trees that have these sets have died from fire, disease, or just old age. Even the snags have long since fallen. This tells me nothing stays the same. Everything changes, even in the wilderness, including me, which for me is the saddest part of all. It amazes me how much my life is like and will be like the old marten sets. Seeing the marten also reminded me of when I was working on the North Slope in Alaska. I would come out for a couple of months every winter and trap with my dad. Unlike most people in today's world, we treated trapping like a job. We trapped 6 days a week and were gone from the house by 6 a.m., not getting back until late at night. If we figured out the hours we put in, we didn't even make wages. But this was the most time in my life that I spent with my dad, one-on-one. My brother David sometimes would trap with us too, which made the time spent that much better. We all enjoyed the time we spent trapping marten the most. David said seeing the marten tracks around the elk on this hunt brought back memories of Dad to him too. The size and number of the fresh marten tracks also got my brother curious, so he began following them, thinking he might see a marten. All this time, Wayne and I were working, quartering up the elk. It snowed so much I can't find the tenderloins, Wayne complained. I jokingly told him, the marten probably took them. Don't worry about it, we have plenty of meat. About that time, David excitedly yelled at us, I see a tenderloin under the big spruce tree. We barely had time to think about how the tenderloins could get under a different tree than the one Wayne had put them under when David yelled again. Can you believe this, marten? When he had reached in and pulled out one of the tenderloins, a marten was holding on to the other end of it, growling and hissing. He won't let go, he said, laughing. Wayne came back with, Do you blame him? He obviously knows the best cuts of meat. This will always be one of the funniest memories I have, and I can still envision it like it was yesterday. The marten was pulling and tugging on a chunk of meat that was 2 or 3 times bigger than him, and was not the least bit intimidated by David, trying to pull it away from him. After a few minutes of the tug-of-war, David finally picked the tenderloin up and started swinging it around in circles. The marten was still stubbornly hanging on for all it was worth, until part of the tenderloin broke off. The marten then sailed out into the brush with the meat. "Go get the rest of the tenderloin," Wayne ordered David. David smiled at him and said, "You go try and take it away from that marten. I'm thinking that we'd better get packed up and out of here before he comes back for more meat." Still laughing, we tied the quarters onto the horses and were on our way back to camp. Since the snow had never let up, we were hoping we would cut some fresh elk tracks, but we didn't. Just before we got back to camp, I heard David chuckling to himself. "What's so funny?" I asked. "I outsmarted those lazy friends of yours and only cut enough firewood to keep the tent warm last night." After reaching camp, the three of us took up our routine. When I was watering our stock, two other guys were watering their stock, too. There were 4 in their party, and they had just gotten to Pentagon that morning. They told me they had come all the way from Pennsylvania. It didn't take long to realize they were greener than us, but they were friendly and fun to talk to. I invited them over to dinner, telling them we were going to have fresh elk tenderloins. They wanted to get all the information they could about the country and where they might find elk, so they were very excited about coming to our camp. When I got back to our tent, David walked over to Wayne and me. I could tell something was really bothering him. "Jack, if you're going to bring your clients hunting, I'm staying home." Wayne quickly chimed in. "I'm not coming either." I had to admit my friends weren't much help and were continuously fighting with each other. David quickly told me the reason he was so mad. Instead of cutting the firewood they needed to keep the tent warm, they had burnt the rounds that we had been using for stools, so we had nothing to sit on. Our neighbors showed up for dinner early and stayed late. We enjoyed their company and tried to help them out, telling them where they should be able to find elk. Usually, we're very selfish about this information, but these guys were so excited to be out west hunting elk, we couldn't help ourselves. Besides, they obviously needed all the help they could get. Like I said, they were bigger greenhorns than us. At least we knew what the mountains and the snow and the cold weather were all about. My friends didn't want to come with us again, this time because we were leaving too early, and they were concerned about the weather turning colder. Besides, they said they had good books to read and might hunt around the tent. David, Wayne, and I decided we would hunt Heart Basin the next morning. And as usual, we were riding in the dark for 2 or 3 hours before dawn. Just before daylight, I had the urge to answer the call of nature. I tied up my horse and walked away from my hunting buddies for some privacy. David and I had been talking about the fact that it was just as cold here as the day we left the North Slope in Alaska. If you spend much time in really cold weather, you'll find one of the biggest inconveniences is that you must wear so many clothes. That morning, I had on 3 layers, the outside layer being my insulated hoodie snowsuit. It was always frustrating to me to have to stop the hunt just to go to the bathroom, but I make the best of it and try to hurry as best I can. It was just minutes after we were back on the horses when I smelled elk. For those of you who haven't smelled elk, it's a musty odor, partly caused from the bulls urinating on themselves. The odor is unpleasant, unless you are an elk hunter. Most of the time when you've smelled elk, they're not very far away. So when this happens, we always get off our horses, tie them up, and start hunting. And that's what we did. After 15 to 20 minutes, we all met back at the horses. None of us saw any fresh signs, which was very disappointing, and I couldn't understand why. We had been on the horses only a few hundred yards when I smelled elk again. A serious hunter never ignores his senses and doesn't just rely on his eyes. So, without questioning me, we all got off our horses and went for another hike. Again, we saw a few tracks, but nothing fresh. For a 4th time, I told David and Wayne we need to get off the horses and tie them up because I smelled elk again. They were starting to get irritated and less confident in me. But I was still able to talk them into tying up the stock and trying to find the elk I was smelling. I don't understand why you can't smell them. It seems really strong to me, I said. In those kinds of weather conditions, you always dress much warmer when riding a horse. So, when we get off to hunt, we always take off our coveralls and face masks. If you don't, when hiking, it doesn't take long before you'll get wet with sweat. No one wants to be wet in below zero weather. Getting off the horse, finding a good tree to tie to, pulling your gun out of the gun scabby, getting partially undressed, hiking around looking for help, then getting dressed again and back on the horse takes a considerable amount of time and effort. When pulling my coveralls off for the fourth time, smelling the aroma of elk stronger than ever, I noticed something in my hood. I finally knew that what I had been smelling was not elk. I had pooped in my hood. So when I pulled the hood up over my head to stay warm, I kept smelling something I thought was elk. Thank God, it was not nearly as gross as it could have been. For one, I had on a full face mask that came down over my neck, so nothing touched my skin. Fortunately, everything had stayed in the hood. I'm sure you can imagine how hard David and Wayne laughed at me. Even for me, this had to be one of the goofiest and most embarrassing things I've ever done, but too funny not to tell. Now that we figured out I was not smelling elk, we were able to make much better time trying to get to the huge grassy meadows of Heart Basin. As we climbed in elevation, the snow intensified, especially the wind. Coming out of the cover of aspen, I saw below us a nice, mature bull. It's more unusual than most people might think to be able to ride a horse within shooting distance of a bull elk without them knowing you are there. But because of the storm, luck was with us. The snow was quiet and the wind very noisy, blowing from the bull to us. I stepped off the mule I was riding and took David's reins while he was pulling his .338 out of his gun scabbard. What happened next was a learning experience for all three of us. Like a lot of hunters at that time, we had been using .30-06 rifles. We had found we did not have the knockdown power we felt we needed, especially at long distances. We were not killing the animals with one shot, which all hunters want. The elk Wayne and I had shot a couple days before is an example of what I'm talking about. David had done some research and decided a .338 was a great elk gun. I was looking for a different caliber too, but ended up shooting a 7mm Magnum. I was using this rifle because I had known several hunters who had changed from the traditional .30-06, but mostly because some clients had given it to me as a gift. Wayne was still trying to figure out what rifle he wanted to use to hunt elk. The bull elk was over 200 yards away, head down and feeding. When David pulled up and offhanded shot the gun behind the shoulders, the elk did not run off and did not fall down. It was knocked down like it was hit by a freight train and laid there without moving. All three of us were extremely impressed. We'd never seen an elk get knocked down when shot, and especially at over 200 yards. I had killed 11 bulls with my 7mm. Not one of them fell where I shot him. Both Wayne and I were hunting the following year with the .338s. Just as a side note, the 7mm Magnum does a better job with the new bullets we have today. Wayne and I could not tell who'd actually killed the bull we'd shot together, so we flipped a coin to see who would get the elk. Wayne won. At least he thought he did, but I was the true winner because I could keep hunting. After I talked to them, Wayne got some help from our other hunting partners to help pack Dave's bull back to camp, while David accompanied me on the next day hunt. We decided to hunt Heart Basin again, but did not find anything in the meadows at this time. We rode all the way up through them and didn't stop until we got to the Continental Divide. In this area, the Continental Divide is very easy to find. It is a huge cliff that runs 4 miles called the Chinese Wall. Most of it is impossible to climb. When we got to the wall, there was a lot of open country to the west of us, so we sat down and glassed from elk. We saw some wallows in the basin of Goat Creek. We were excited about this because finding wallows is a good sign of elk being in the area. Most hunters know big game animals in the Northwest start getting uncomfortable even when the temperature is mildly warm. This causes them to find springs in muddy areas where they can roll in wet mud, making wallows. Besides cooling them down, it also helps keep the bugs off them. At this time, my brother and I only knew about elk wallows, but were soon to learn grizzlies had wallows too. Not long after we found the wallows, we watched a grizzly waddle out of the timber to enjoy his muddy bath in the wallow. It didn't seem to bother him that he had to break ice to use the wallow. When the bear was still in the mud, we heard an elk bugling down in the next basin. We were both thankful it wasn't in the same basin as the bear. Our strategy is always to go to the bugles as fast as we can because you never know when an elk is going to quit. Being inspired by his continual bugling, we jogged as much as the cliffy terrain would allow. Trying to stay well hidden, we made a circle to keep the wind coming towards us so he could not smell us. We got within 300 yards of the elk, but because he was in thick cover, we could not see him. Then, off to our left, 2 cows burst out of some thick cover, running like jackrabbits towards the bugling bull. The cows must have winded us, because we saw the herd disappearing over a ridge about a quarter-mile away. Thinking all the elk might not have left, we decided to eat our lunch, hoping something would happen. Like most elk hunters, we had learned that if you get into elk, don't be in a hurry to leave. Unfortunately, this time nothing happened, so we left. When we got back to our perch on the wall, we sat down to drink some water and take a breather. It had continually gotten colder, but at least for the moment, it had stopped snowing. I have countless memories of hunting with my brother, but this memory comes back to me by far more than any other. Briefly, the clouds lifted, making it seem like we could see forever and feel like we were on the top of the world. With our legs hanging over the edge of the cliff, we sat in silence for what seemed a long time. This gave me time to reflect on what we had experienced over the last few days. We were obviously having a great time, but the biggest thing that came to mind was how hard we had worked at having a good time on 2 or 3 hours of sleep at night, riding in the dark for hours, both morning and night, and the terrible weather conditions. Also, by this time, we had walked a ton of miles in very rough terrain. I knew the most significant part of this was that we were not the least bit tired. In fact, we were feeling great and wishing we could do this forever. I looked at Dave and said to him, "Brother, there is going to come a day when we are not going to be able to hunt like this." He looked at me with an understanding expression. "I know, Jack," he said sadly. We all tend to be very good about putting these kinds of thoughts out of our minds and just keep living day to day. But David and I can't do that any longer, because the days have long passed where we can enjoy and not just endure physical fatigue, hiking 20 hours in sub-zero weather, ride an animal we could put a saddle on, drive at night, then ride 30 or 40 miles and hunt the next day without any sleep. But because we loved being there so much, unlike so few others, at least we have the memories. After taking time to drink a little water and enjoy the view, David and I headed back to where we had left the horses. When we got there, we hurried up and tightened the cinches on the saddles, mounted up, and started riding back towards camp. There was enough daylight left that we were hoping we could find some more elk. David was out front, and after we had ridden only 200 or 300 yards, he pointed up the hill, saying, "Look, a black bear." He quickly dismounted and started to get his rifle out of the gun scabbard, then found it wasn't there. David told me he'd left his rifle where we had last tied up the horses, then asked me if I had seen the bear. I said no. Then he said something that I thought was peculiar. If a bear is black, it has to be a black bear, right? Sure, I told him, and handed him my rifle. I'll go back and get your gun. When I returned, I heard him yell at me, Jack, bring my pistol up here. I've got the bear up a tree, and I want to shoot it with my pistol. David, you don't want to shoot a little bear, I said, thinking it was a young bear that he'd treed. This bear isn't that little. I walked up the hill through thick huckleberry brush until I got to see him and found myself looking at something that would surprise anybody, no matter how much time they'd spent in the back country. On this little knoll, I saw something that reminded me of what you might see in a Dr. Seuss's child's book. There was an old snag, a little bigger around than most telephone poles, which had a fork in it, about 12 feet up. The tree split in two, and sitting in the fork was the bear. When I say sitting, I mean sitting, just like you or I would, back completely straight, legs and feet hanging down, an arm wrapped around one of the forks. What amazed me even more was the beauty of the bear's coat. It looked black as coal from a distance, but when you were close, you could see that the tips of the hair were as silver as a quarter and ran from his neck across his shoulders, halfway down his back. The other thing that was fascinating is that the bear was making swipes at us with his free paw. He was also popping his jaws hard enough that I remember thinking it sounded like somebody hitting an anvil with a hammer. After taking this all in, I asked David what happened. He explained that he'd tried to head off the bear and was walking through thick huckleberry brush when he came face to face with it again. He was so close that when I brought my rifle up to shoot, all I could see in the scope was hair. The bear was even more surprised than me. He took one jump, hugged the tree, and the next thing I knew, he was sitting in the fork. David, you need to take a better look at this bear. You could not see the hump on his back because he was sitting upright against the tree, but what you could see and what I told him to look at were the round teddy bear ears and the huge claws hanging from his paws. It's a grizzly, isn't it, Jack? When I stopped laughing, I told him, it's going to be hard for people to believe, but you treed a grizzly. All the ones we saw in Alaska were blonde, he replied. Now we know what people mean when they talk about silver-tipped grizzly bears. No one ever explained that they are black like this guy. Trying to redeem himself, he said from a distance, the silver tip on his guard hair can't be seen, so, of course, he looks like a black bear. Then, for whatever reason, I reached down and picked up some rocks that were a little smaller than a golf ball. I lopped them up softly to the bear. Not hard enough to hurt, just teasing him a bit. He actually caught one of the rocks in the crook of his arm, smelled it for a moment, and dropped it. When he did this, David turned around and looked at me. Why doesn't that scare you to be throwing rocks at a grizzly? He asked. I went ahead and lopped my last rock and said, that's easy enough to explain, because I'm standing behind you. He didn't laugh at this, just said, let's get out of here. After we got back on the horses, David said he thought grizzly bears couldn't climb trees. The reason for David thinking the bear was a black bear, besides its color, is that it's well known grizzly cubs climb trees, but can't when they get older, whereas a black bear's claws are shorter, giving them the ability to grab bark, making it easy for them to climb trees. Also, having shorter claws makes black bear tracks distinguishable from grizzly. You can seldom even see the claw marks of a black bear, but the grizzly leaves a track with claw marks 3 inches in front of their toes. David and I had several hours of riding before we got back to the camp. As usual, it was well after dark. Wayne had a great dinner cooked up and invited our neighbors over again for dinner. We all laughed over David treeing a grizzly. Our neighbors not only hadn't taken any elk, but hadn't even seen one. We told them where we'd shot our elk, and about other places we knew would hold elk. They said they were more determined than ever, and were not going home until they got their elk. We talked to them about the storm advisories that we had heard over the radio, which said blizzard-like conditions were coming out of the north. Our neighbors thought that maybe it had already happened. We told them we didn't think so, that in high elevations the weather conditions were like a different world than down in the valley and could be extremely dangerous. The next morning it was obvious the storm was later than expected, but was going to be as bad as it was expected. We broke camp as fast as we could, packed the horses, and started back to the trailhead. We had a lot less trouble with the packs than we'd had on the way in, an indication we were not the greenhorns we were on the way in. The ride out was miserable, with blowing wind and snow. Thinking about our camp neighbors, I could only imagine how bad it was up in the higher elevations where they were now hunting. I couldn't help worrying about them. I was also wondering how our truck would perform on the way home. We all made it back home without any problems, because the old truck performed very well for us after we got the bugs worked out. We ended up getting several years of use out of that old truck. The first thing that I did after we got home was call an old friend of mine, Clint Miles. I got to know Clint because he was caretaking a ranch up in the Yack. I did a considerable amount of real estate business with his employer, and spent as much time as I could with Clint. He had outfitted in the scrap goat wilderness for more than 20 years, and knew more about wildlife and hunting in the back country than anyone else that I ever met. I told him the story about my brother treeing a grizzly. I was wondering whether he'd believe me. "How big was the tree, Jack?" he asked in his low voice. "About the size of a telephone pole." He then explained that while mature grizzlies can't use their claws to climb a tree like a black bear, they can hug the tree and shimmy up it if it's not too big around. The other question I asked him was why we'd seen so many grizzly bears when it was so cold. "Aren't they supposed to be hibernating?" He told me grizzly bears don't hibernate as early in the fall as black bears do, and will even come out in mid-winter sometimes. The other thing he told me was that they'd cover a tremendous amount of territory the time of the year looking for gut piles of elk and deer people had shot to try to get some extra protein before they go to sleep for the winter. About a week after we returned, I got a phone call from Jody, one of our hunting partners. He told me that he'd heard on the news that 2 men who were hunting up spotted bear had been lost for the last several days. After calling the sheriff's department, he didn't have any doubt that it was our camp neighbors. Their hunting partners had reported 2 of them missing, and the only thing they found of them was one of their horses tied to a tree. Even though we didn't know them very well, we were all understandably upset. This kind of thing is only supposed to happen in movies. This taught me some people don't get a second chance to learn how dangerous the backcountry can be. Unlike some of the people reading this, I have had hundreds of chances to learn what can make a paradise of memories turn into a deadly experience. With the hope that you can learn from me, I will tell you the 3 things that are the deadliest in the backcountry: the cold, being lost, and getting seriously injured. Not being prepared for the worst, and understanding that you have to depend on yourself when things go sideways, is the biggest problem people have on a wilderness trip, because it will usually take too long for anyone to get to you, if they can even find you. Some of you might consider the use of an outfitter and guide to help keep you safe and to enjoy the land beyond all roads. I've hunted Heart Basin several times since our last trip. I always think of the guys from Pennsylvania.